Okay, so now we're going to get into the meat of the course. Eventually, where we want to get to is pricing options, pricing derivatives. As we study, though, mathematical finance, think about how really mathematical finance is the original mathematics. Math was basically invented for financial gain, to keep track of your stuff. The oldest representations of mathematics, like carved on this Paleolithic bone that you see here, was basically counting time, counting sheep, keeping track of harvests. And when we get to, in this chapter, we talk about futures contracts as a concept that we're going to use to introduce arbitrage. But when I get to futures contracts, this really ends up being the beginning of mathematics, the beginning of symbols, even the beginning of language and written language itself. So, futures contracts. Way back in ancient times, you would enter a futures contract. You would be saying to your fellow farmer, this is right at the beginning of agrarian society, maybe you raised pigs and your next door neighbor had a garden, raised wheat, and it looks like carrots there. And you would say, well, at the end of the year when you get your harvest, I promise you give me 2 pigs and, I'll give you 2 pigs and you give me 5 carrots and 5 things of wheat. You'd agree on that. Well, you'd shake hands. This would happen in the spring. And then along comes harvest, comes September, October, and then there might be some dispute as to, oh, you said I would get 3 pigs, not 2 pigs, and then you argue it out. Well, to enforce these contracts, what they started to do was they started to make little clay representations. So little clay representations of 2 pigs, little clay representations of the wheat and the vegetables, and then that would remind them, that would keep everybody honest as far as what was the deal was. Well, it would keep everybody honest except for maybe you're afraid that your neighbor's going to, hide one of these carrots, throw out one of these little carrot figurines. So then what they started to do was they said, well, we'll make these figurines and then we'll encase them in a clay box, in a clay envelope, let's say, seal them up, and that way, come the fall, when me, you, the town official, we break it open, and everyone can see, oh, yeah, the deal was 2 pigs for 5 wheat and 5 carrots. Well, so that's how things worked for a while, keeping these futures contracts. And already you see the idea of modeling, right? The clay pigs were a model for real pigs. They're a representation, a model for the real pigs. So already we're sort of modeling real life. Well, this worked well, except for sometimes, we're supposed to settle this contract in September. We make the contract in the spring. Maybe come along July, we sort of have a discussion of what's in there, and we want to check, was it 5 carrots or 4 carrots? We would have to go to the town official, break this clay pot open, recount them again. Oh yeah, you were right, there was 5 carrots. Reseal it all up and then start again. Well, that started to be a lot of trouble. So what they did was they would write, this is cuneiform writing, taking a reed and pressing into clay. They would just write on the outside what's inside. Inside this clay envelope, there's 2 pigs, 5 wheat, and 5 carrots. That way, you didn't have to break it open every time. You could just read the outside. That saved time. Then, eventually they said, well, why are we making little clay pigs and little clay wheat when we're just reading the outside anyway? Let's just dismiss with the figurines, never mind sealing things up, we'll just write it on the tablets. So now we're at this stage where we're writing on clay tablets, essentially keeping track of our stuff, business contracts. And so writing, math modeling, writing written language was born in order to keep track of your stuff, to write down these futures contracts. So you always hear when they're digging up something in an ancient site and they find writing. When they find the writing, it's usually never anything that you would think would be so important. It ends up being shopping lists and inventory lists. Much of the math, much of the writing is just evolved to keep track of your stuff. So that's futures contracts. So what's a stock? A stock is a share in a company. So if I wanted to start a business and I needed capital, I might sell off a portion of my company to investors. They would give me money, they would buy a part of a share in the company, and they would receive a share in the profits. Of course, they also receive a share of the risk. If my company does well, then their stock increases in value. If my company does poorly, then their stock decreases in value. I keep calling it a share of the profits, a share of the risk. They own a share of the company. Why don't we just call them shares? Why do we call them stocks? Well, it goes back to old times when you would buy a share in the company. You would buy a share in the company, a stock in the company, and they have to write this down on a contract. Well, what they would do in ancient, in UK, is they would take a piece of wood and a stock, and they would write the contract on the piece of wood. You gave Professor Brooks $8 for 10% of his company. And then they would break the stock in half. And half of the stock you would own as proof of your ownership of a portion of the company, and half of the stock would go to the into the city hall to be kept. And that way, if you wanted to verify that you didn't change the contract, we could take the two pieces of wood and stick them together and they would fit exactly back. Now, you're probably wondering, what's all this in the background here? Well, where did they keep these things? They kept them in the city hall. Well, in London, in the Parliament, they just kept them in the basement. Of every time they sold a stock, they wrote a contract, they'd break this piece of wood in half and put another dry piece of tinder in the basement, and eventually, the place burned down. Great Fire of London. But anyway, that's why we call them stocks, and we should probably just call them shares. All right. So what will we be focusing on in the rest of this course? Well, already we've talked about pricing bonds, pricing annuities, which I'm viewing basically as the same thing. We're just pricing a cash flow, and by pricing cash flows, we're just talking about the time value of money, making all the cash valuing all the cash at the same time. Well, one of the main themes then that we'll be focusing on are derivatives and bonds. Bonds we've already done. So those are sort of the two ways that we can invest: debt versus equity. A debt is where I lend a company money. So buying a bond is a debt. A bond is debt. If the company does well, I don't make any extra money. If the company does poorly, assuming that they still honor their bond agreement, I don't make any less money. Whereas equity is ownership in the company. I own a share in the company, a stock in the company, as we said. If the company does well, then I do well. If the company doesn't do so well, then I don't do well. We're also going to be thinking about pricing the main math, the interesting math, the math I find very interesting is pricing options, derivatives. Now, a derivative is a financial instrument whose value is derived from some other underlying asset. So let's, for now, just think about a stock. So a call option, we'll call a call option on a stock. That's a promise. If you own a call option, what you own is actually a promise that a promise that I will sell you a stock at the agreed upon exercise price at some time, the expiry date in the future. So here's the graph of a call option payoff. We must have had the expiry or the exercise price is $100. So whoever owns this call option owns the right, not the obligation, the right to buy a stock from me at $100 next week. So if the stock is trading at $110, well, that call option would be worth $10. They would give me $100, get the stock, immediately sell it in the market for 110. So they would profit $10. So that's where I'm getting this payoff line right here. It's the difference between the exercise price and the stock price in the market. Of course, if the stock price is selling for $90, if the stock is selling for $90 in the market, I wouldn't buy it for $100 from someone, so the call option in that case expires worthless. So a call option is either worth 0 at the end if the stock is less than the exercise price, or it's worth the stock minus the exercise price. So this is the if the x-axis here is graphed as S, the stock price, this line here would be S minus 100, S minus the exercise price. So let's take a look at a forward contract. A forward contract is where I promise to pay at the maturity time, capital T in the future, to buy a stock that'll be worth, okay, how much is the stock going to be worth? Well, we don't know, but it'll be worth whatever S of capital T is. So I promise to pay F in the future. So we shake hands, I'm going to give you F dollars for the stock. How much should that be worth? Well, at the end then, I get, so at time T at expiry, what do I get? I get the stock, which is priced S of capital T, and I give you F dollars. So I have at the end S of T, S of maturity minus F. That's what I have. So now let's look here. Capital T is the end, little t is the now. At the beginning, I don't give you any money. So to enter into the forward's worth nothing now. I don't give you any money. At the end, the forward's worth the S, the stock price at the end, minus the difference between the stock price and the amount of money I give you. Well, if I short the stock, in other words, if I sell the stock I don't own now, then that stock debt is worth minus S of T. At maturity, I still owe the stock, but now the price of the stock is S of capital T, which might be the same, it might be bigger, it might be smaller, we don't know. When I shorted the stock, now I get this much cash, so S of T cash in a number. I invest that at the risk-free rate, so I get at the end that S dollars, S of T dollars, and it grows by the risk-free rate. So e to the r T, capital T minus little t, that's the time that it grows. So we've got what the forward is worth now, what the forward is worth in the future, what the stock debt is worth now, what the stock debt is worth in the future. The cash I have now, and it grows with time value of money. When I sum up the whole portfolio that I made, then the total portfolio is 0. So the total portfolio here should also sum up to 0. Well, if I do sum this up, then this S of T cancels this F of minus T, and I end up getting and we know that has to be 0, so therefore, okay, no arbitrage, this has to be worth 0. The portfolio, what portfolio did I have? The promise of the forward contract, shorted a stock and had some cash. That was my portfolio. It was worth nothing at time little t, so it has to be worth nothing at time capital T. That gives us then the formula for how much this forward contract should cost, how much I should pay at the end. It's just whatever this number is, S of T, what the stock is worth now, grown by time value of money at the risk-free rate. No arbitrage means that has to be the price. That has to be how much the forward contract costs, how much I would pay in the future. If someone was selling it for less, so in other words, they were selling it at less than this formula capital F, then I would buy all these contracts and then make an arbitrage free profit. What if someone was selling it at more than this F? Could I still make money? Well, I'd have to short the forward, have to do the opposite of this, do it with the negative. But this is our first example of using the no arbitrage rule to generate a pricing formula, the price of a forward contract. Keep in mind, this forward contract it's not like an option. I don't have the option of not buying that stock in the future for F. It's an agreement he has to give me the stock for F, and I have to give him F dollars for the stock. It's not like an option where it's a right, where I have the option. It's a promise. We both have to go through with the deal.